Security is a continual process because the attackers are out there. They're always out there. They're always evolving. They're always improving. And we need to do the same thing. So a lot of these OT environments, like I always think, like a power plant, you go in there like, well, we're NERC compliant, so we're all good. Like, no, that's not how it works. There's probably about 5 million different ways, right, to break into a NERC compliant environment and have some type of negative impact to that plant.
Welcome to the Industrial Cybersecurity Insider. In each episode, we dive into the world of industrial cybersecurity. Join us as we cover the latest trends, innovations, and practical insights as we talk with leaders and practitioners across the industry. Gear up and let's get into this week's episode.
Hi, this is Dino, and today we have a special guest, and his name is Mike Holcomb. Hi, Mike. How you doing?
Good, Dino. How are you?
Great. I think I'd like to kind of kick these things off. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey into the whole realm of cybersecurity and specifically OT cybersecurity.
Sure. Yeah, I'll try to keep it short, but let me say thanks for the invite. I grew up with my best friend who was kind of the traditional hacker kiddie. And so he would like crack games so you could copy them illegally. He would write cheat codes for games so you could get unlimited gold or guns or lives. And I just was always fascinated with that. I was the good kid and I would never do anything bad, but I would watch. And so, yeah, I kept watching as he evolved in what he was working on, and movies like War Games had come out. I really kind of fell in love with that movie, and it kind of just continued to take me down that path of not only computers, but the idea of how we can use computers for hacking, right? Whether for good or for bad, and everything in between. So that just always stuck with me through my career. So it started in IT roles in high school, took a side detour through movie theater, best job still ever had. Worked in a bowling alley, actually did some electrical work as well as some computer stuff there. And then went to China for a couple of years, came back to San Diego, and then it was off to the races in the IT world. So it was pretty much doing IT and then starting to work in security and showing, and actually wrote, so I was working for a computer training company, doing all the networking stuff, and actually wrote a cybersecurity course before we called it cybersecurity. And just seeing, at the time, where not a lot of environments in the business world understood they needed cybersecurity. And that's kind of the point we were at in the OT world as well, especially 4 or 5 years ago. We've come a long way since Colonial Pipeline, and I guess I'm jumping ahead a little bit. But I was always this, IT cybersecurity nerd, and got into OT when Stuxnet was announced in 2010. And I was just fascinated with this really advanced piece of malware that not only got into this plant environment in Iran, where they had the centrifuges that enriched the uranium gas, so they would eventually make nukes, but that the malware would get in, it would physically break down those centrifuges. So using physics to break down these real machines in the actual real world, which I was absolutely fascinated with. And then what really hooked me was at the same time, they made it look to the operators as if nothing was going on. If you're sitting in the control room back in the Tans in Iran, that you're looking at all the lights and everything looks good, even though behind the scenes, the machines are breaking down. They're wondering what the heck is going on. That was really the big hook for me. And so just getting into this question of, well, how does this work like in a power plant or water treatment? Because I had friends in power and water, and started asking them, and they didn't know. And some kind of got a little angry because they weren't doing anything about it. Right? They didn't even think of it as being a thing. And thankfully, after about a year, I got my job at Fluor. Didn't have a clue as to what Fluor did. I just knew that I had to get away from my last boss. Yeah, did not like him for many reasons. Had to get away. Got a call, ended up working at Fluor, and then found out we're one of the world's giant engineering companies. And we build the largest control system environments that are out there. And so I just got really extremely lucky. And so I've kind of migrated from doing, IT at Fluor into the OT world. And I get to learn from some of the best engineers in the world. And they've really accepted me into that. So a big part of what I do now is take that information kind of from my background in IT and then also in OT now, and working with all these great people and a lot of the great people in the community, and then putting that content out on LinkedIn and YouTube to help other people that are interested in OT cyber to follow that path.
It's an interesting path, that's for sure, right? My path is not too dissimilar to yours, and almost 4 decades of working in technology and 35 of it in the manufacturing arena and around the world. Like you, I didn't live in China for a couple of years, but I did work over there. And I recognized, from moving from what happened in Iran to being able to create such a sophisticated malware to target those control systems in the manner in which they did, and then spoof the HMI so that the operators couldn't tell there was anything going bad. Whoever the nation states that were to develop that stuff had to turn around and figure out a way to defend against that stuff, which brings us to where we are today, right? And so knowing that, having that IT background and being involved in the industrial arena on the OT side, what do you think are some of the biggest challenges that we're facing to really get this moving into the next level, really to kind of catch up where IT has had 2+ decades, running at cybersecurity technologies and building practices and resources and budgets and awareness? What's going on the plant floor on the OT side in your mind?
It's slowly making its way over to OT, but in the OT world, still very much to me like how the IT world was before the Target breach. Before Target, there still wasn't a lot of awareness, especially among executives, right, corporate leadership, that they needed to do something about cybersecurity. Even the military had very little, in the way of cybersecurity before the Target breach, which is really scary, right, to think of. And the Target breach really changed that. Thankfully for us, taking the silver lining into context, that the Colonial breach that happened, the Colonial Pipeline breach that happened in May of 2021, where we had the longest gasoline pipeline in the United States go down for 10 days because of ransomware. And that had very much the same impact as Target, right? Where the world saw that. And if you lived on the East Coast, right, you would go to the gas station and there wasn't gas. Now you could go around the corner and another gas station had gas, but there was a super long line and they might run out before you got to the front. And you had to go through that for like a week and a half or so. So there's a real world impact that everybody saw, and they started to realize maybe we should start to take this seriously. So the IT world has changed dramatically since 2021.
To me, what I see as one of the biggest challenges, Mike, it's the asset ownership, right? I mean, when you think about technology, generally speaking, in a company, IT owns that, right? Unquestionably, they have a role and a responsibility around those business systems and the infrastructure which those things operate on and the users that use them. But when you make that shift to the plant floor, to those industrial control system assets, they don't own those. They don't pick them. They don't design them. I come from that world. If I'm putting in a $20 million packaging line as part of the firm that I work for a client, I don't have IT in the room. Not that we don't invite them. The client doesn't bring them to the table to participate in the design and architecture of what this $25 million piece of equipment is going to do. As far as the computers that are being picked, the operating systems we're using, how we're going to configure, how we're going to set them up, the networks in which those things are running on, the firmware that the PLCs are using, the choice of the PLCs that you're using, and at the same time, I'm not getting any direction from the CISO or the CIO that says, hey, we have an OT cybersecurity strategy, Mr. OEM or system integrator, and here's the guidance and the roadmap that we want to put in front of you as you're designing and building these machine centers for us. That's the thing that's not gelling, in my view. I don't know if you see it differently, but I work on the other side of the house. I don't work in the IT ranks. We deal with them. Lou Ray's probably heard this 100 times, and so is our audience. I want them on the field. I need them in the huddle. I just don't know if they can be the quarterback, if that makes sense.
It does. And you do see that a lot. And it just depends on the environment, but you kind of see all different variations in different organizations. And so you're right. A lot of it is somebody taking ownership for cybersecurity, for OT, just even OT in general. And sometimes you can have that, but it's very, very rare. And then, of course, you get in the question of is it OT doing that? Is it IT doing that? Or maybe it's shared responsibility. And then it gets into the question of, are they working together or are they butting heads or maybe they're just not communicating it at all?
You're right about that, because I will tell you that when you have those two groups working well together, where they're aligned and they're collaborative and they're transparent, then it's a beautiful thing going through one of these types of exercises. But to your point, if they're thumping at each other and don't work with each other, or neither one of them has the resources within the organization really to deal with it effectively, then you're right. It can be a heavy lift.
For sure. And yeah, I've just seen too many teams that really are falling down and mostly just because they're not talking, whether they perceive the other team hates them or doesn't want to deal with them or work with them, or they think they're not easy to work with, but for whatever reason, they're not talking and nothing's getting done.
There's the environment, right? It's not uncommon. This happens a lot. We initiate a project. You obviously got to start the plant. You got to think globally, but you got to act locally. And we'll come in and meet with IT teams that have never been to the plant, or maybe come to the plant once a year or every other year. And so they're too far removed, from what's really going on in there. And so in order to fix that, there has to be some continuity between those two groups. And it can't be a spot check, periodic, or I don't want to go work in the plant because it's hot or it's dirty or it's dangerous or it stinks or whatever. That's another challenge. Again, I guess that's more of a cultural or behavioral thing for some to want to get past that, right?
Yeah, it's just a different world for them, right? And I get that.
Right.
But if you're going to work in an environment and OT's attached, if you have a plant, you need to be exposed more than once a year. It's not going to get it done, or less than once a year is not going to get it done.
What do you see coming around the corner? That's going to shape this in your views. And it is, they are getting better. The awareness is out there, right? The technologies are maturing, and getting better, specifically on the OT side. What do you think else is coming, to help shape this industry?
The two things, and kind of look at it, from the good side and the bad side. I think, as you mentioned from the good side, that there is more awareness, more organizations are doing more. Owners and operators are realizing that they need to take cyber seriously. On the other hand, you have more attackers out there realizing, oh, they have to take OT cybersecurity more seriously too, right? The ransomware group operators, the hacktivists, the state adversaries, they are all coming. And the number of attacks has just continued to ramp up since Colonial Pipeline. And there's a lot coming down the pipe, just looking at the numbers, right? And the growth in attacks. And there are so many environments out there that aren't prepared, let alone over the last year or two. 2 years ago, we were looking at kind of hints that you had state adversaries working with hacktivists and ransomware group operators. And now you fast forward to 2025, and now there's much stronger links and evidence to show that. So Rob Lee at Besides ICS this year in his keynote was really, promoting this idea and helping people understand that not only are we not prepared for what's coming, but it's going to be worse than a lot of people are expecting, because now you have state adversaries, which are typically, right, they're low frequency, right? We don't see them that often pop up, but when they do, there's that high impact, right? They do very bad things. With hacktivists and ransomware operators are kind of in the middle, but like with hacktivists, right? They're all over the place. You see lots of incidents with them, but it's very low impact, right? They don't have the technical skills or the tools. Well, now you're seeing them start to work together and to align. And now you start having the knowledge and the skills and the tool sets of the state adversaries start to, filter into the ransomware groups and into the hacktivists. And so now you set yourself up for this idea of now we have high frequency, high impact event, and the world is not ready for that. because we have so many OT environments out there that they don't have somebody for OT cybersecurity, let alone IT cybersecurity, right? Let alone maybe even IT at all, right? They're a small shop and they have to bring a consultant in, which they probably could barely afford when they do that.
Right. Well, Gartner came out with a report at the end of last year that said in the next 2 years or so, 25% of the cybersecurity professionals are going to leave the field altogether. That was what Gartner posted. And to your point on the OT side, it's rare to find folks that have a background both from an industrial perspective and from a technology, networking, and cybersecurity perspective, really to shore this stuff up. Because when you talk about Colonial Pipeline and some of the other incidents that have hit manufacturers, what I always find amazing is when these events have, even the CrowdStrike event that happened last year was impactful to the plant floor, because it seems like people just ignore the fact that there's a tremendous amount of Windows operating systems out there running those control systems. It's like, and so they automatically think IT, they think the business systems, but the plant floor is being impacted, right? The HMIs, for example, are running on Windows operating systems, and some of them very old. We still find Windows 7 and XP out there, and Windows 10 that's not even being supported anymore, just because the life cycle is different with these OT assets compared to the IT assets. You're talking about decades versus, a few years, several years. And so it bleeds over versus a very targeted control system attack like the Stuxnet one that you mentioned, or the Red Triton being another one, where those were targeted at control systems. And I'm going to ask you your opinion on this. And I think this is going to really change the dynamic of being able to target those control systems. And I think that's going to be AI. I think that's going to teach these bad actors on how to go after those control systems.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. But you do think, right, at a high level, that it makes sense that if the attackers are using, say, Gen AI, not only to learn how to like help them break into the OT network, but also then to be able to gather the information that they need to reverse engineer the process in that plant. At that point, then they actually have the information within maybe 3 months, maybe 6 months, or a lot faster using Gen AI to be able to essentially, again, decipher or reverse engineer how that process works. And at that point, once they have that information, that's where they can impact the process. And whether that's, I'm going to shut down the plant and I'm going to do it nicely and securely, right? Probably not the route that an attacker would take, or they're going to make something go boom. Right? And that's, I think, the biggest concern.
Right. Going after control systems puts you on a different playing field on how you'll be viewed compared to just hacking into somebody to try to extract money out of them or steal their IP, versus doing something that's going to make something go boom, or do an environmental release of some sort of hazardous materials, or to hurt or kill people. That puts you in a whole different playing field, where now you might have, like the U.S. government really wanting to hunt you down compared to, okay, they asked for $5 million from company X and they paid the ransom. And there's a lot of companies that just pay it. I was at a client last month. They just wrote a check and paid for it to get the keys back. They were down for a week. They took the week of downtime and then just wrote a check to get back up and running, and versus trying to fight through it, which we've seen some clients do, like Clorox, that cost them hundreds of millions of dollars and tried to fight their way through it. And it took them over a year, and sometimes longer than that, to try to get things back to normal. And they're not even sure if they're normal still, but it just varies depending on who's doing what and who you are and who you're attacking, right? I mean, it just makes a difference on who the target is.
It's absolutely true. So it'll be interesting. I do find it fascinating. This is another thing that Rob Lee touched on in his keynote at B-Sides ICS this year, was this idea that with Typhoon, right, being in all these critical infrastructure environments. And usually when we think Chinese and the Chinese are in the environment, oh, they're stealing proprietary information, right? They're going to sit there and they're just going to watch over time, but they're not going to do anything. In this case, with Typhoon or Sight, which is the OT group within Typhoon, they were getting into OT environments and critical infrastructure, and they were taking screenshots of HMIs. They were stealing GIS data. They were pulling data from historians. They were taking everything you would need to reverse engineer the process of that plant. And of course,
it's crazy to think about that we have the tools and technology to be able to demonstrate and show to you that that's happening today. We can see those communication flows. We can see where that data is flowing, in and out of that environment, and what signatures are sitting in there to be able to do that kind of stuff. It's a little mind-boggling when because the IT folks, they can't see it down at that level within the control system space per se. Even with their tools, maybe they're catching some of it, but they're fighting. They got like a fire hose pointed at the whole time with things that are constantly, people trying to crack and hack and hit them constantly, right? But on the plant floor side, they just think those things are still air gapped. They think that those machines are not connected to the network, and COVID kicked that door wide open for remote access for support, right? And, we find on average 4 to 7 different remote access technologies in a single site, right? You got 50 plants in your fleet. You just multiply it out of all the different types of remote access methods that are being used for third parties and their own external people, internal people to gain access into that environment to support it.
Yeah, no, it's very true. Yeah, you just start touching on, there's a lot of challenges, right? A lot of environments, right? Some are looking at those risks, right? They are looking at the environment. They're looking for those remote access tools. And unfortunately, a lot of those environments aren't. Going back to Rob, but he was talking this year about less than 5% of OT environments are performing network security monitoring. They're not even looking, right? So how are you going to know if you're compromised if you're not even looking? And even 5%, I'm like, probably half of those are not doing a very good job. so it's probably more like 2.5% that are actually monitoring their networks worldwide. So we see a lot of bad stuff, and and that's only with monitoring. So let's say 5% of the OT networks out there.
In my experience, and I've been doing this for years, if I go into 10 plants, 2 of them I'm going to find malware. It's nature of the beast. It happens. But every single one of them, Mike, will have rogue assets. Every single one of them will have an asset or 2 or 3 sitting in there that neither side knew anything about, or how it got in there, why it was there, or what it was doing. Every single time.
Someone brings their own personal laptop in, right? Let alone the contractor, right? Coming in to fix something or do maintenance, right? Or I've even gone into clean areas in a plant and someone's got a smartphone plugged in, with a USB cable and like in the clean room. I mean, like what, it's just amazing, that you see.
Yeah. And we have the technology to see that, I've seen that myself. I've seen a cell phone in a control room that's being charged, popping up on my OT IDS platform. There's Mike Holcomb's iPhone. I can see it, and it's got Wi-Fi and he's got cellular on it, it's got Bluetooth on it, and it's connected to my control system network. So, yeah, well, one of the questions I always like asking OT executives when the opportunity presents itself is, are you executing the same amount of due diligence to secure and protect your industrial environment as you do the enterprise? And I can tell pretty quick whether they're doing that or not. But and a lot of IT folks, they don't want to have anything to do with that. Back to the, the head button going on because they don't have any influence over it, right? Back to that conversation. And how do we change that model? Or as I've been, subscribing to, that the OT ecosystem has to get better at this. The people who design and build these plants and these control systems and these machine centers and the infrastructure in which they reside on have to start coming to the table with strategies and ideas for the client.
They need to learn how to. That's something that the people in IT have been doing for decades. And It just isn't something that folks in OT have traditionally done. It's just like, and if you're not doing that, and if you're not stepping up to the table, and if you're not bringing those suggestions, if you're not coming and doing your pitch and even asking for budget, right? If you're not asking for these things, you're not going to get the help that you need, unfortunately. So a big learning curve, I think a lot of leadership in the OT world has to take on, unfortunately.
Well, and to the CFOs, you have to demonstrate to them that there's value. in this, right? I have to see the benefit and the value. And it takes a certain skill set to be able to do that, in my view, to understand the process, understand the operations of what these plants do, those machines do, and then talk about disruption. I used to work for a very large adult beverage manufacturer based out of St. Louis. You can probably guess who that is. And if we had one packaging line, not putting beer in a bottle or a can, that was 80 grand an hour in loss. This is gone. There's no time capsule to get in to go back to make up for that. I'm paying salaries. I'm wasting, consuming natural resources. I'm sewering beer. I got trucks waiting, I'm paying taxes, and it's just loss. All right. You lose the entire packaging environment. Now you're talking about $500,000 an hour in downtime, and so is it relevant? Yes. The question is, are you really measuring your unplanned, unscheduled downtime? Because process integrity comes hand in hand with the cybersecurity tool sets and solutions and operations, the way that these things operate, right? I can tell if IT is scanning the network. Take pen testing, for example, right? If somebody's pen testing my plant while I'm running, that's very disruptive, right? And then they learn it's like, well, that knocks me offline, so let's not do that. Let's do it during off hours or during downtime and maintenance windows. Well, that's great, but now the machines that you want to test to find out vulnerabilities, well, they're offline, and so you can't see them. So what good is that, right? And so you have to have these conversations with folks and bring them up to, again, think globally, but you got to act locally.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and kind of goes back to you have to work together and you have to communicate, because if you're not, you're just gonna be putting up all these roadblocks and nothing gets done.
Yeah. So as we wrap up, what is the one or two pieces of advice that you would like to give our listeners as they're going through their OT cybersecurity journey? What would Mike say to them?
My big thing is always just never stop improving. And that's for whether you're just trying to get into the industry and learn more about OT cyber, keep at it and keep learning every day and start, trying to get hands-on experience with labs and maybe some on-site visit and build from there, right? Always improve. I think for folks that already work in the industry, always keep improving. I see, unfortunately, too much in OT, and you see this a little bit in IT as well, but a lot of OT environments that I've seen is they do have somebody come in and help them to do maybe a risk assessment, a maturity assessment. They have their list of things that they're going to fix to reduce risk over the next 12 to 16 months. And then, they get to the end and they got their list done and they're done. No, that's not how it works, right? Security is a continual process because the attackers are out there. They're always out there. They're always evolving. They're always improving, and we need to do the same thing. So a lot of these OT environments, like I always think, like a power plant, you go in, they're like, well, we're NERC compliant, so we're all good. Like, no, that's not how it works. There's probably about 5 million different ways, right, to break into a NERC compliant environment and have some type of negative impact to that plant. So we always need to be improving, based off of our resources. I realize not everybody has massive budgets, but we always have to improve, at least with the resources that we can.
Right. Well, and to the budget, again, as you go back to unplanned, unscheduled downtime, what is that costing you? Right. So whatever metric you use, KPI, determine how well you run, and you take most discrete manufacturers, they operate in the 50s and 60s%. Just a few percentage points of improvements is millions of dollars, right, to the bottom line. And so there's definitely always room for improvement. I agree with you 100%. You got to do something to demonstrate that you're getting better, is what I usually say. But to your point, it never stops. You got to prove that you're getting better, right? You have to have a measurement. You can't manage what you're not measuring. Set your baseline and keep ticking away it's never going to stop, right? And it's a continuous process. You have to stay on it. And that's where this IT/OT convergence game, it needs a shot in the arm. Somehow, some way, that piece of that relationship between IT and OT really needs to change that dynamic. It can't be viewed as you're going to overrun my budget. I'm not going to make my startup when I planned on it. You delay it. And that's why a lot of those OT guys will always push back against IT, because they've lived some of the unpleasantries of implementing IT technologies in their environment that are being put down, whether it's firewalls, the network, EDR, just managing through application, manage the infrastructure in which those OT applications are running on. And so there's a frustration level that somehow those groups need to really gel together if they're going to do it.
Yeah, for sure. It goes back, the earlier conversation. It's a people problem, unfortunately, at the end of the day, and people just don't always work well together for whatever reasons. Yeah, my girlfriend's a therapist. We talk about it from time to time, and but it sounds like I always think of it, in terms of a lot of her clients is, she does couples counseling, right? And you have a couple, right, that if they're at each other's throats, or again, they're not communicating, nothing's getting done. And I've seen that, unfortunately, in too many environments. Now, have I seen bad environments where IT and OT start to communicate and start to work together and they do improve over time? Yeah, I have. And that's a beautiful thing. But I also know there's a lot of environments out there that they're still either fighting or not talking to each other either.
I think there's a little bit of a scale problem too when you talk about, when you do have those groups that are working together where they assign IT and OT people to work on this common challenge, but then you got 50 plants in your fleet, right? And all of a sudden, those couple of people that you chose to do this, they're not going to be able to get this done in this decade, right? I mean, so you either have to expand your resource pool, and there's a lot of third parties out there that can assist with that. That's why IT is leaned on managed services for so many years, to bolster infrastructure support, application maintenance, working on an ERP development, whatever the case may be, because you need those skills at the right time in order to increase your ability to get this effort done. And I think the same is true when it comes to this particular challenge. Is you're going to have to start relying on others. That's why I say the OT ecosystem has to bring their A game to the table and assist with that, right? Because that's who the OT people tend to trust. That they view them as being credible because they build these things, they maintain them, and they support them, right? If you buy a new GM, you don't take it, to Joe's garage. You take it back to the certified, dealership that works on GMs, all right, to fix your vehicle. It's kind of the same concept. But anyway, well, with that, I think we'll call it a wrap. It was nice talking to you today. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks for tuning in to the Industrial Cybersecurity Insider. To stay up to date with our latest episodes, be sure to click the follow or subscribe button now. And if you found this podcast helpful or have a topic you'd like us to discuss, please leave us a review or let us know. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.